Hello. This video is all about a mysterious character called Melchizedek. And he's very mysterious because although he plays a very small part in biblical stories, he has a big effect. And the mystery of Melchizedek is that he has no lineage. Nobody knows who his parents are or his grandparents. So there's a suggestion that Melchizedek is not an earthly person at all, because, as you may know, the Jewish people were very keen on lineage, and they were always writing down about who begat whom and so forth. So for somebody to turn up in their story who doesn't have this lineage is very significant indeed. Although Melchizedek first appears in the old part of the Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, and in the book of Genesis, which is part of the Torah, the medieval Christians were certainly very keen on Melchizedek. The cathedral at Chartres has a statue of Melchizedek among the other saints and angels. He also appears on one of the stained glass windows directly beneath the rose window. So what makes this character so important in the spiritual quest? Melchizedek's name has become very popular in New Age spirituality. He appears in some New Age card packs as a kind of ascended master or angelic figure. And I certainly believe he can be very powerful to work with, as you will discover. But New Age content is very light and doesn't explain the breadth and the depth of this potential. And also, I would say Melchizedek is a descended master, not an ascended master. But certainly he could be an incarnated angel. The story of Melchizedek is very ancient indeed, goes back to the time of Abraham, which was likely as early as 1800 years BCE. So that's nearly 4,000 years ago. This is around the time the Vedas were being composed by Hindu sages. The first reference to Melchizedek can be found in the Jewish Torah in the book of Genesis, where he is described as the king of Salem and the high priest of El Elyon. That's the most high God. Notice he is both a king and a high priest. At that stage in Jewish history, these were not separate roles. The royal lineage was not established, and the inherited system of priesthood was also not in place. In Genesis chapter 14, we learn that Abraham, then known as Abram, has just won a battle. And this mysterious character Melchizedek comes to meet him on the battlefield. And he brings bread and wine. He blesses Abram, and he also declares blessings for El Elyon as well. And this is the very first mention in biblical history of a consecrated celebration of the divine using bread and wine. The Friday evening Sabbath celebration that still takes place in Jewish homes to this day likely has its roots in this story. Before the Second Temple was destroyed 70 years after Jesus, the high priests would celebrate the Sabbath with bread and wine, which was set out on what was called a show table. The Hebrew blessings over wine and bread are Borei Peri Hagafen, fruit of the vine, and Hamotzi Lehem Haaretz, the grain from the earth. It is the bread and wine celebration that Jesus conducts at the Last Supper, when he suggests to his apostles that his own blood and his own body will be like the wine and the bread. This is why many Christians take wafers and wine at Sunday services. Although the Catholics don't always take the wine, except at special ceremonies like weddings, they're very nervous about spilling the wine because it represents, or for them it actually is, the blood of Christ. So, who was Melchizedek? This story in Genesis tells us very little. It only describes his role. The only other reference to him in the Jewish bit of the Bible is in one of the Psalms, Psalm 110. And there we are told, "The Lord has sworn, and the Lord will not repent. Thou art a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." So this suggests there are different orders of priesthood, not just one. So later in their history, the Jewish people created 2 temples. The first one was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, and the second was destroyed after the Romans took over in 70 CE. So those are several hundred years apart. But both temples were managed by high priests, and they always claimed that role because they were Levites from a particular tribe descended from Aaron, who was the brother of Moses. So this was a family business. You had to know your lineage in order to be a priest. So the idea of priesthood is that a person, in this case a male person, the role of priestess is very different, but that's a completely different story, which we might talk about another day. But this priest acts as an intermediary between heaven and earth, between divinity and everyday people. At its highest ideal, this is a shamanic role, and not one just based on intellectual or theological study. The priest protects and nurtures the eternal flame in the sacred space, where a mystical section is kept separate, the Holy of Holies. This space allows the divinity to descend and make a home among mortals. The priest keeps himself pure to make a suitable vehicle for divine messages. So, what's this got to do with the Christians? Well, Jesus arrived in this biblical history nearly 2,000 years after Abraham. And after Jesus died, an apostle called Paul had a lot to say about the connection between Jesus and Melchizedek. St. Paul became an evangelist for Christianity, even though he'd never met Jesus. And he had many things to say, especially about the role of women, which I reckon Jesus would not have been happy about. Paul wrote many letters to his fellow travellers, who were all looking to convert the Jews and the non-Jews, and they wanted to set up churches. So in a series of letters addressed to the Hebrews, we find a whole chapter about Melchizedek's priestly role and how it relates to Jesus. I should just mention here that there is scholarly argument as to whether these letters to the Hebrews were actually written by Paul himself, but that is how they are identified in the Bible. So this letter, these series of letters, particularly in chapter 7, Paul, or whoever, is setting out an argument about the role of priesthood. So firstly, he's telling us that the temple priest role was inherited. Okay, so the priests were always descendants from the brother of Moses, and they were given tithes by the people in order to support them. A bit like, Buddhist monks perhaps are given money by the people for doing the spiritual work. Melchizedek, by contrast, he is the one who gives the tithes. He doesn't ask for tithes, he gives them to Abraham. Next, what is most significant is that Melchizedek is reported to have no lineage, no parents. So the author of these letters is pointing out that he's an eternal figure who will not die, unlike the Levite priests who are only human. Now, he says, Jesus was not from a family that inherited the priesthood. He was not from the Levites, but he is a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And of course, he has a lineage because he can claim kingship from David's line. And the evangelist tells us Jesus lives forever, whereas other priests come and go, being subject to human mortality. So, writing before the fall of the Second Temple, which happened 70 years after Jesus, so he was probably writing about 60 years after Jesus had died. And, of course, the temple priests were still in action at that point. They hadn't yet been made redundant. And the author of these letters wanted to coax practicing Jews into the new religion. He wanted to impress the idea that Jesus was a high priest, that Jesus was able to intercede with divinity. He was assuring the Jews that Jesus was the promised Messiah. He was not a military king going to claim their land back for them by force, but he was the Messiah because he was a priest of the order of Melchizedek. He was an eternal being, not descended from Moses or anyone else for that matter. So Melchizedek's name in Hebrew derives from two root words, and this gives us a clue to his spiritual role. So Melch bit means king, and Zedek bit means righteousness. So notice the Zedek. This is the same root we find in the name of the Archangel Zadkiel. So here is an image of Zadkiel from my own experience. This was made for the Angel Script pack of cards and was based on my original painting of an inner vision. I originally did my path working on the Tree of Life in the early 1980s. I'd been prompted by an unexpected inner vision of an angel I later identified as Sandalphon. I had little background knowledge of Kabbalah or the archangels, and I'd certainly never heard of Melchizedek. But when I met Zadkiel, he certainly looked like a high priest. In Hebrew, the name for the planet Jupiter is Zadok. And in classical Kabbalah, the Sephira associated with Jupiter is also associated with the archangel Zadkiel. So let's have a look at this. Melchizedek equals high priest and king is connected to the archangel Zadkiel and to the planet Jupiter, bringer of joy. So let's have a look at this story from a Kabbalistic perspective. The ground plan of Chartres Cathedral is set out according to the Tree of Life map. So let's see what goes on with that map. Notice the archangels below Dat, the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, which is the bridge between the upper and lower sections of the tree. Zadkiel is the last archangel before we get to Dat. So Dat is the equivalent of the veil concealing the Holy of Holies. The Jewish temples and the architects who built Chartres Cathedral and many other religious buildings of the time were all concerned to create sacred spaces that echo metaphysical reality. The priestly archangel, or Melchizedek, offers us bread and wine as symbols. Wine for heaven and soul, bread for earth and body. These symbolic stories describe our spiritual process. We want to ascend to heaven and receive a sacrament that allows us to function as both spiritual and physical beings. We want to integrate these two apparently separate and possibly even antagonistic parts of ourselves. Even if we don't consciously realize it, we are being called towards the priest who works for us within our inner sacred space. Whatever name we choose to use for the gatekeeper who opens the portal to heaven for us, we must pay due reverence to this process. We must find our own favourite ritual that honours the archetypal. Bread and wine are ideal. So don't think this metaphysical process is only under the auspices of the male archetypes. Chartres Cathedral is famous for the Black Madonna. Like the Shekinah, she is the hidden feminine. Always present to nurture the growing soul, she is Malka Ora, Queen of Heaven, where Melchizedek represents the king. In the alchemical process, male and female come together in a sacred marriage. So perhaps now the time is arising when we can make new covenants with the male and female archetypes. I want to close this video with a prayer I have been given during recent meditations with the Shekinah. Sweet Lord and Lady, King and Queen of heaven within, holy are your names. Allow us to see the promised city of joy manifest in our world. Give us this day life-supporting necessities in abundance, and let our cup of bliss overflow. Forgive our ignorance and lack of attention, as we forgive others who act in ignorance. Lead us out of the cloud of unknowing and foolishness, along a clear path of wisdom, towards the kingdom, the power, and the glory. Salah.